The world of politics is full of flamboyant figures, but only a select few are capable of holding the planet's attention for decades. Vladimir Putin is a leader who forced the world to reckon with Russia once again. But who was he before his motorcade first swept into the Kremlin? Many see only the man in the suit, a stoic figure of authority. But behind that image lies a long history of struggle. This is the story of a boy from the gritty backstreets of Leningrad who learned early on to strike first. It is the story of a young intelligence officer who witnessed his ideal world crumble in Dresden. And it is the story of a civil servant who, amidst the chaos of the 1990s, remained steadfast in his principles. In this video, we won't just list dates from a textbook. We will attempt to decode the logic of a man who reshaped the course of 21st century history. The story of Vladimir Putin begins on October 7, 1952. At that time, Leningrad was a city still laboring to heal the deep scars left by the 900-day Nazi siege. His parents, Vladimir Spiridonovich and Maria Ivanovna, were people forged in the fires of war. The president's father was a man of stern discipline. During World War II, he served in an NKVD destruction battalion, carrying out sabotage missions behind enemy lines. One of the most harrowing episodes of his life was the defense of the Neva Pyatachok, a tiny bridgehead that was essentially a meat grinder of constant shelling. He was severely wounded by grenade fragments, carrying that physical pain for the rest of his life. His mother, Maria Ivanovna, was his father's emotional opposite, gentle, kind, and deeply religious. She survived the blockade within the city itself, witnessing the death of loved ones and nearly succumbing to starvation herself. Vladimir was their third son. His two older brothers, Albert and Victor, had passed away in childhood, one before the war, the other during the siege. Volodya became his parents' reason for living. He was their miracle child, born later in their lives. The family lived in a communal apartment. To understand the reality of that era, one must visualize it: the fifth floor of a building with no elevator, wood-fired heating, one kitchen shared by several families, and a toilet located on the stairwell landing. In such cramped quarters, there was no room for secrets, but there was ample room for the development of ironclad endurance. Putin recalled that the stairwells were infested with rats. Once, armed with a stick, he cornered one of them at the end of a hallway. With nowhere left to run, the rat suddenly lunged, jumping directly at the boy. Putin had to flee. This seemingly minor domestic incident became his first lesson in strategy. Never corner an opponent into a dead end unless you are prepared for their desperate resistance. The Leningrad courtyards of the 1950s were a territory governed by strength. No one cared how many books you had read. All that mattered was whether you could stand your ground on an insult. Young Volodya was not a titan of physique. On the contrary, he was quite thin and short for his age. Because of this, he often faced injustice and aggression from older, tougher boys. His first weapon was his temperament. He was bold, quick-tempered, and refused to be bullied even when the odds were against him. But he soon realized that boldness alone was not enough. At the age of 12, he made a decision that would define his life. He signed up for Sambo classes, later transitioning to judo. His first coach, Anatoly Raklin, became a second father figure, a man who taught not just techniques, but the discipline of the spirit. Sports pulled him away from the negative influence of the streets. While his peers were taking up smoking or joining local gangs, Putin spent all his free time on the mat. Judo provided him with a profound realization. Strength is not just about muscle, it is about the ability to wait, to use the opponent's momentum against them, and to maintain icy composure even when faced with direct aggression. Interestingly, in his early school years, the future president was far from a model student. His diary was often filled with notes about his disruptive behavior, and he wasn't even admitted to the young pioneers immediately. However, as soon as sports entered his life, his attitude toward his studies shifted. He realized that if he wanted to achieve something greater than a life in a communal flat, he needed knowledge. By the 8th grade, he began to take his education seriously, developing a deep interest in history and foreign languages. It was during this time that a new, even more ambitious goal began to root in his mind, a goal he was hesitant to share even with his closest friends. By the mid-1960s, Soviet cinema screens were flooded with images of heroic intelligence officers. Films like The Shield and the Sword or Dead Season portrayed the secret agent as an intellectual warrior who, alone behind enemy lines, could outmaneuver entire armies. For the young Vladimir, raised on his father's stories of wartime sabotage missions, this was more than mere entertainment. It became a calling. While other teenagers dreamed of the sky or the sea, Putin dreamed of the invisible war. In the 9th grade, he took an action that characterizes him better than any biographical record. He went alone to the reception desk of the KGB Directorate for Leningrad and the Leningrad region. He simply walked in off the street and asked, "What do I need to do to work for you?" The officer on duty was likely surprised by such bluntness, but he answered seriously. "First, you need to either serve in the army or obtain a higher education, preferably in law." From that moment on, Vladimir's entire life was subordinated to a single goal. Gaining admission to the Faculty of Law at Leningrad State University, LSU, was a nearly impossible task for a young man from a common background. The competition reached 40 applicants per seat, and most candidates were either gold medalists or had significant work experience. Putin tackled his studies with the same tenacity he brought to the tatami mat. He understood that the slightest mistake on an exam would shatter his dream. In 1970, he successfully enrolled as a first-year student. Putin's university years differed strikingly from the typical student life of the era. He was not the life of the party. He did not participate in the loud, boisterous gatherings in the dormitories. His lifestyle remained ascetic. University friends remembered him as a reserved person, always composed and extremely disciplined. He spent the vast majority of his time either in the library or the gym. His only luxury was a Zaporozhets car, which his parents had won in a lottery and given to him, despite continuing to live very modestly themselves. In 1975, during his final year at the university, a man approached him and suggested they talk about the future. It was a KGB officer. The dream he had pursued for years was finally beginning to take a tangible shape. His service did not begin with foreign assignments, but with meticulous work in the Secretariat, followed by a stint in a counterintelligence unit. This was his school of patience. The young officer Putin learned to analyze massive amounts of information, draft reports, and notice details that eluded others. Colleagues noted his diligence and a rare ability to listen. Before long, the leadership took notice of the promising young officer. Putin was sent for advanced training in Moscow at the Red Banner Institute of the KGB, now the Foreign Intelligence Academy. There he was given the operational pseudonym Platov. Here he was trained in the art of recruitment, psychology, operational work, and most importantly, the German language. He studied it until he could speak without an accent, like a native. He was being prepared for work in environments where the slightest oversight could cost him his career and his freedom. Putin was preparing to head into the field. He did not yet know that his first foreign assignment would become his greatest life lesson and a point of no return. Ahead was Dresden, the city where he would witness the sunset of a great empire. In the early 1990s, Leningrad reclaimed its historical name, St. Petersburg, but with it came the notoriety of being the criminal capital of Russia. It was a time of the Wild West in the East. Factories were shuttering, inflation was devouring life savings, and yesterday's gangsters were becoming the new masters of life. Upon returning from Germany, Vladimir Putin was officially listed as an assistant to the rector of Leningrad State University for International Affairs. However, his analytical skills and discipline quickly found a purpose within the new government. In 1991, he became the chairman of the Committee for External Relations in the mayor's office. His superior was Anatoly Sobchak, a brilliant orator, a professor of law, and one of the most prominent leaders of the democratic wave. If Sobchak was the face of St. Petersburg, Putin was its engine. While the mayor gave speeches at rallies, Putin handled the gritty but vital work, attracting foreign banks such as BNP Paribas and Dresdner Bank to the city, organizing a currency exchange, and, most crucially, saving the city from famine. In 1992, St. Petersburg stood on the brink of a food collapse. Putin organized a resources for food scheme. The city exported rare earth metals and petroleum products, and in exchange, it was supposed to receive meat and grain. This episode later became a source of loud accusations and investigations, but the fact remained: the city survived. Putin learned to operate in an environment where old Soviet laws no longer functioned and new ones had yet to be written. In those years, he was known as the Gray Eminence. He was a man of few words, always dressed in a sharp suit, and possessed the ability to find common ground with everyone, from foreign investors and security officials to representatives of the shadow world. It was then that he learned a vital lesson. In chaos, the winner is the one who keeps his word and maintains control over the situation. In 1996, Putin's political future hung by a thread. Anatoly Sobchak lost the election for governor of St. Petersburg. The new administration offered Putin a chance to stay in City Hall, recognizing his professionalism. But he made a choice that many considered political suicide. He resigned. Putin publicly stated, "It is better to be hanged for loyalty than for betrayal." He was left without a job, without clear prospects, and once again, as after his return from Dresden, he seriously considered working as a taxi driver. But his reputation as a man who does not betray and an effective manager had already reached Moscow. In the summer of 1996, Putin was invited to Moscow to serve as the deputy chief of the Presidential Property Management Directorate. His career ascent in the capital was meteoric, almost supernatural. 1997, deputy chief of the Presidential Administration. 1998, director of the FSB. He returned to his home agency, but this time as its head. May 1999, secretary of the Security Council. Moscow in the late 90s was a snake pit of political intrigue. Boris Yeltsin was frail, oligarchs were dividing power, and the country was sliding toward an abyss. Against the backdrop of aging and corrupt politicians, the 46-year-old Putin, athletic, sober, stern, and focused, looked like an outsider from another world. On August 9, 1999, Yeltsin appointed him prime minister and, in a televised address, named him his successor. Most experts at the time merely smirked. Another placeholder. He won't last 2 months. But they underestimated the man who had graduated from the school of Leningrad backstreets and Dresden intelligence. The most massive chapter of his life was about to begin. December 1999. Russia was in a state that many political analysts described as managed chaos. Boris Yeltsin, the first president of Russia, was gravely ill and losing the support of the populace. The economy had yet to recover from the 1998 debt default, and the Caucasus was in flames once again. Militants had invaded Dagestan, marking the beginning of the Second Chechen War. The country did not need an orator, it needed a crisis manager. Vladimir Putin, appointed prime minister only a few months prior, began to act with a decisiveness that many found startling. It was during this time that he uttered his famous words regarding the fight against terrorism, words that made the nation sit up and take notice. "We will hunt them down. Even in the toilet, we will wipe them out." It was a raw, direct, street-style sincerity that the people, at that desperate moment, preferred over the empty promises of career politicians. December 31, 1999. While the entire country was preparing for the holiday, a drama was unfolding within the Kremlin walls. That morning, Boris Yeltsin summoned Putin to his office and informed him that he was signing the decree of his resignation. Putin later recalled that this was not a moment of joy for him. On the contrary, he understood the heavy burden of such a fate. On one hand, there is the internal logic, should I or shouldn't I? But on the other hand, what a massive responsibility, he said. But there was no turning back. At noon, Yeltsin's emergency address was broadcast on television. His phrase, "I am tired, I am leaving," though his literal words were, "I am leaving, I have done all I could," signaled the end of an era. At that very moment, Vladimir Putin became the acting president of the Russian Federation. What did Putin do on his first night as president? He didn't stay to celebrate in the Kremlin. He boarded a helicopter and flew to Chechnya, to the town of Gudermes. It was an incredibly risky move. Due to poor weather, the helicopter could not land at the designated spot, and the president had to reach the soldiers' positions by car, traveling along mined roads. He arrived to congratulate the troops and personally present them with commemorative knives. It was a powerful symbol. The new leader was not hiding behind the walls of the Kremlin. He was where the situation was most dire. This gesture sent his approval ratings soaring. The people saw in him not just a bureaucrat, but a commander-in-chief. On March 26, 2000, early presidential elections were held. Putin won in the first round, securing more than 52% of the vote. It was a phenomenal result for a man who, only 6 months earlier, had been virtually unknown to the public. On May 7, 2000, the inauguration took place in the St. Andrew's Hall of the Grand Kremlin Palace. Placing his hand on the Constitution, the former officer from a Leningrad communal flat swore to protect the rights and freedoms of the citizens. In his speech, he uttered a phrase that would define his policy for years to come. "We want our Russia to be a free, prosperous, rich, strong, and civilized country, a country that its citizens are proud of and that is respected in the world." Russia entered the new century with a new face. The work of gathering the lands and restoring order to a state that yesterday had seemed terminally ill was just beginning. When Vladimir Putin rose to power, the real masters of Russia were the oligarchs. These men, Boris Berezovsky, Vladimir Gusinsky, Mikhail Khodorkovsky and others owned the major television channels, dominated the oil industry, and held immense influence over the Kremlin. During the 1990s, they had grown accustomed to dictating their terms to the president. But Putin proposed a new set of rules. In the summer of 2000, during a meeting at the Annunciation Cathedral in the Kremlin, he articulated the principle of equidistance. Business could remain wealthy, but it no longer had the right to influence state policy. Those who refused to accept these rules soon felt the full weight of the state machine. The media influence of Berezovsky and Gusinsky was the first to fall, as key television networks were brought under state control. But the most high-profile case was that of Yukos. In 2003, Russia's richest man, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, was arrested. His company, a massive oil giant, was effectively nationalized. It was a clear signal to everyone. In Russia, there is only one center of power: the law and the Kremlin. The early 2000s coincided with a phenomenal rise in global oil prices. Russia, possessing colossal natural resources, began to experience an oil rain. However, the crucial factor was how Putin chose to manage this wealth. Under his team's leadership, a landmark tax reform was implemented. A flat 13% income tax was introduced, which effectively brought business out of the shadows. Russia began to pay off its massive foreign debts, accumulated since the Soviet era, ahead of schedule. A stabilization fund was created, a financial cushion that would later save the country during future global crises. The quality of life for ordinary citizens began to soar. Wages and pensions increased several times over. A middle class emerged, people who could finally afford foreign cars, vacations abroad, and mortgages. For many Russians, the name Putin became synonymous with the word stability. Parallel to the economy, Putin reformed the structure of the state. To end the paralysis of power, he created federal districts and appointed his own plenipotentiary representatives. The system for forming the Federation Council was changed, and direct elections for governors were abolished following the Beslan tragedy in 2004, a move that centralized the country's management in Moscow. Critics accused him of rolling back democracy and restricting freedom of speech. However, for a large segment of the population, weary from the poverty and chaos of the 1990s, order was perceived as more vital than political liberties. It was during these years that the unique image of Putin, so beloved by photographers, was solidified. He flew in fighter jets, descended to the bottom of Lake Baikal in a submersible, practiced judo with world-class masters, and rode horses in the mountains of Tuva. This image of a strong, active, and sober leader stood in sharp contrast to his predecessor and many Western leaders of the time. By the end of his second term in 2008, Putin was at the peak of his popularity. Russia had returned to the club of world powers. However, according to the Constitution, he could not run for a third consecutive term. The world held its breath. Would he actually step down, or would he find a way to stay? The answer to that question marked the beginning of a new, even more complex chapter of his biography. In 2007, at the Munich Security Conference, Vladimir Putin delivered a speech that would later be called the point of no return. He openly criticized the unipolar world order and stated that NATO's expansion toward Russia's borders was a direct threat. Western leaders were shocked. Putin was no longer willing to play by the rules imposed on Russia in the 1990s. In 2008, following the Constitution, Putin did not run for a third consecutive term. Dmitry Medvedev was elected president, while Putin took the post of prime minister. This tandem period allowed him to focus on the economy during the 2008 global financial crisis, while maintaining control over the country's strategic course. In March 2012, Putin returned to the Kremlin. His third term began with a monumental project, the 2014 Sochi Winter Olympics. The Games were a triumph, showcasing a new, strong Russia to the world. But just days after the closing ceremony, geopolitical reality changed forever. Events in Ukraine led to Crimea officially joining the Russian Federation in March 2014. Domestically, this triggered an unprecedented patriotic surge, but internationally, it led to harsh sanctions. Putin demonstrated that he was willing to break with the West for what he considered. In 2015, Putin made his next strategic move by launching a military operation in Syria. This brought Russia back to the Middle East as a key player that could not be ignored. By the end of the decade, leading into 2019, Vladimir Putin had become a figure around whom the entire global agenda was built. Russia learned to live under sanctions, and Putin himself finally solidified his status as the leader of a fortress nation, prepared for a long-term standoff with the West to preserve the country's sovereignty. The end of the second decade of the 21st century brought a challenge for which no one was prepared: a global pandemic. For Vladimir Putin, this was a test of the state system's resilience. While the world went into lockdown, Russia moved to implement large-scale economic support and develop its own vaccine, Sputnik V. The president transitioned to a remote working mode from his residence in Novo-Ogaryovo, sparking much discussion in the media, yet control over the country remained firmly in his grasp. In 2020, Russia voted for sweeping changes to the constitution. This was the most significant political move of the decade. It enshrined social guarantees, the priority of Russian law over international law, and included the resetting of presidential terms. This provided Putin with the legal opportunity to remain in power until 2036. He explained this as a necessity for stability, stating, "Russia has exhausted its limit for revolutions." Many wonder, what is Putin really like? Those who have worked with him for years note his phenomenal memory and attention to detail. He can recall figures from a report he read 6 months prior. He is extremely disciplined. His day is scheduled to the minute, and there is always time for sports. Hockey has become more than just a hobby for him. It's a way to decompress. He created the Night Hockey League, where he takes to the ice alongside sports legends. He also continues to practice judo, emphasizing that martial arts taught him to respect an opponent while always being prepared to defend himself. His love for Russia's wilderness is not merely an image. Rare footage of him vacationing in the taiga of Tuva or Siberia, fishing, hiking through mountains, and sleeping in tents shows a man deeply connected to his land. He often remarks that Russia is not just a country, but a civilization state. Today, Vladimir Putin is one of the most experienced world leaders. Behind him lie decades of governing a nuclear superpower. His decisions provoke intense debate, but one fact remains undeniable. He took over a Russia that was weak and fragmented and turned it into a player without whom no global issue can be resolved. His journey continues, and no matter how much the world changes around him, he remains faithful to the principle he learned in his Leningrad childhood. Being strong is not a choice, it is a necessity.